Hello littles, I'm Amma. Why don't you put on your softies and join me for a story? I have my hot chocolate and my storybooks all ready to go. So let's begin. Hello littles, today we're going to read the story of Thumbelina by Hans Christian Andersen. Once upon a time there was a woman who wished very much to have a very small child, but she did not know where to get one. So she went to an old witch and said to her, "I would so very much like to have a small child. Can you tell me where I can get one?" "Oh, we shall soon be able to manage that," said the witch. "Here is a barley corn. It is not of the same kind that grows in the farmer's field or that the chickens get to eat. Put it into a flower pot and you will see something." "Thank you," said the woman, and gave the witch 12 shillings, for that was the price of it. Then she went home and planted the barley corn. Immediately there grew up a large, handsome flower, looking like a tulip. The leaves, however, were tightly closed, as though it were still a bud. "It is a beautiful flower," said the woman, kissing its red and yellow leaves. But as she kissed it, the flower opened up with a bang. It was a real tulip, as could now be seen, but in the middle of the flower, on the green velvety pistils, sat a tiny maiden, delicately and gracefully formed. She was scarcely half of a thumb's length high, and therefore she was called Thumbelina. A neat, polished walnut shell served Thumbelina for a cradle. Blue-violet leaves were her mattresses, and a rose leaf her blanket. There she slept at night, but in the daytime she played about on the table, where the woman had put a plate with a wreath of flowers around it, the stalks of which stood in water. On this water floated a large tulip leaf, and on this she could sit and row from one side of the plate to the other, having 2 white horsehairs for her oars. It looked wonderfully pretty. She could sing too, and indeed so tenderly and prettily as had never been heard before. One night, as she was lying in her pretty bed, an old toad came creeping in through the window, in which there was a broken pane. The toad was a very ugly one, large and wet. It hopped down onto the table where Thumbelina lay sleeping under the red rose leaf. "She would be a pretty wife for my son," said the toad, taking the walnut shell in which Thumbelina was sleeping and hopping with it through the window down into the garden. There flowed a great wide brook, the margin of which was swampy and marshy, and here lived the toad with her son. Ugh! He was so ugly and nasty and looked just like his mother. "Croak, croak, croak," was all that he could say when he spied the graceful little girl in the walnut shell. "Don't speak so loud, else you'll wake her," said the old toad. "She might run away from us, for she is as light as a swan's down, so we will put her on one of the broad leaves of water lily in the brook. That will be just like an island for her, and she is so light and small she will not be able to run away from here, while we are getting ready the stateroom under the marsh, where you will live and keep house." Out in the brook there grew a great many water lilies, with broad leaves which looked as though they were floating on the water. The leaf which lay farthest off was the largest. To this the old toad swam out and laid the walnut shell with Thumbelina upon it. Tiny Thumbelina woke early in the morning, and when she saw where she was, she began to cry bitterly, for there was water on every side of the great green leaf, and she could not get to land. The old toad was sitting in the marsh, decking out her room with reeds and yellow flowers. It was to be made very pretty for the new daughter-in-law. Then she swam out with her ugly son to the leaf where Thumbelina was. They wanted to fetch her pretty bed, which was to be placed in the bridal chamber before she herself entered it. The old toad bowed low in the water before her and said, "Here you have my son. He will be your husband, and you will live in great splendor down in the marsh." "Croak, croak, croak," was all that the son could say. Then they took the pretty little bed and swam away with it, leaving Thumbelina sitting alone on the green leaf crying, for she did not want to live with the nasty old toad or have her ugly son for a husband. The little fishes swimming down in the water had both seen the toad and also heard what she had said. So they put out their heads, for they wanted to see the little girl too. As soon as they saw her, they thought her so pretty that they felt very sorry that she was to go down to the ugly toad. No, that should never be. They assembled together down in the water round the green stalk that held the leaf on which the tiny maiden stood, and with their teeth they gnawed away the stalk. The leaf floated away down the stream with Thumbelina, far away where the toad could not reach her. Thumbelina sailed by many towns, and the little birds sitting in the bushes saw her and sang, "What a lovely little girl!" The leaf went floating away with her farther and farther, and so Thumbelina traveled right out of the country. A pretty little white butterfly kept fluttering around her, and at last sat down upon the leaf. Thumbelina pleased him, and she was very glad of it, for now the toad could not reach her, and it was so beautiful where she was. The sun was shining on the water, making it sparkle like the brightest silver. She took her girdle and tied one end of it around the butterfly, fastening the other end of the ribbon to the leaf. It glided along much quicker now, and she too, for of course she was standing on it. A great cockchafer came flying along, who spied her and immediately clasped her in his claws around her slender waist and flew up with her into a tree. The green leaf floated down the stream, and the butterfly with it, for he was bound fast to the leaf and could not get away. Heavens, how frightened poor Thumbelina was when the cockchafer flew up into the tree with her, but she was mostly grieved for the sake of the beautiful white butterfly which she had bound fast. In case he could not free himself, he would be obliged to starve. But the cockchafer did not care about that. He sat down with her on the largest green leaf of the tree, gave her honey from the flowers to eat, and told her that she was very pretty, although she was not at all like a cockchafer. Later on, all the other cockchafers who lived in the tree came to pay a visit. They looked at Thumbelina and said, "She is not even more than 2 legs. That looks miserable." "She hasn't any feelers," said another. "She has such a narrow waist and looks quite human. Ugh, how ugly she is." And all the lady cockchafers, and yet Thumbelina was very pretty. Even the cockchafer who had carried her off admitted that. When all the others said that she was ugly, he at last believed it too, and would no longer have her. She might go where she liked. So they flew from off the tree with her and put her upon a daisy. She wept because she was so ugly that the cockchafers would not have her, and yet she was the loveliest little girl that anyone could imagine, as delicate and as tender as the most beautiful rose leaf. The whole summer through, poor Thumbelina lived alone in the great forest. She wove herself a bed out of blades of grass and hung it under a shamrock in order to be protected from the rain. She gathered the honey out of the flowers for food and drank of the dew that was on the leaves every morning. In this way, summer and autumn passed, but now came winter, the long, cold winter. All the birds who had sung so beautifully about her flew away. The trees became bare and the flowers faded. The large shamrock under which she had lived dried up, and there remained nothing of it but a withered stalk. She was dreadfully cold, for her clothes were in tatters, and she herself was so small and delicate. Poor little Thumbelina, she would be frozen to death. It began to snow, and every snowflake that fell upon her was like a whole shovelful thrown upon us, for we are so tall, and she was only an inch long. So she wrapped herself in a dry leaf, but that tore in half and would not warm her. She was shivering with cold. Close to the wood which she had now come lay a large cornfield, but the corn was gone long since, and only the dry, naked stubble stood out of the frozen ground. These were like a forest to her to wander through, and oh, how she was trembling with cold. In this state she reached the door of a field mouse who occupied a hole under the corn stubbles. There the mouse lived comfortably, had a whole room full of corn, a splendid kitchen and larder. Poor Thumbelina stood before the door like a little beggar girl, and asked for a piece of barley corn, for she had not had a bit to eat for 2 days. "You poor little creature," said the field mouse, for she was a really good old mouse. "Come into my warm room and dine with me." Now, being pleased with Thumbelina, she said, "If you like, you can stay with me the whole winter, but you must keep my room clean and neat, and tell me tales, for I am very fond of them." And Thumbelina did what the good old field mouse wished, and in return was treated uncommonly well. "Now we shall have a visit," said the field mouse. "My neighbor is in the habit of visiting me once a week. He is even better off than I am, has large rooms and wears a beautiful black velvety fur. If you could only get him for a husband, you would be very well provided for, but he cannot see. You must tell him the prettiest stories that you know." But Thumbelina did not trouble herself about it. She did not think much for the neighbor, for he was only a mole. He came and paid a visit in his black velvety fur. He was so rich and so learned, said the field mouse, and his dwelling was 20 times larger than hers. He possessed great learning, but he could not bear the sun and the beautiful flowers. Of the latter he seldom spoke, for he had never seen them. Thumbelina had to sing, and she sang, cockchafer, fly away, and when the parson goes afield. So the mole fell in love with her because of her beautiful voice, but he said nothing, for he was a prudent man. A short time before, he had dug a passage through the earth from his house to theirs, and the field mouse and Thumbelina received permission to take a walk in the passage as often as they liked. But he begged them not to be afraid of the dead bird which lay there. It was an entire bird, with feathers and beak, who had probably died only a short time before, and was buried just where the mole had made his passage. The mole took a piece of decayed wood in his mouth, for that glimmers like a light in the dark, and then went on in front and lighted them through the long dark passage. When they came to the spot where the dead bird lay, the mole thrust his broad nose against the ceiling and pushed the earth up so that a large hole was made, through which the light could shine down. In the middle of the floor lay a dead swallow, with its beautiful wings pressed close to its sides and its feet and head drawn under its feathers. The poor bird had certainly died of cold. This grieved Thumbelina very much. She was very fond of all the little birds who had sung and twittered so beautifully to her all the summer. But the mole kicked him with his crooked legs and said, "He doesn't pipe any more now. How miserable it must be to be born a little bird. Thank heaven that can happen to none of my children. Such a bird has nothing but his tweet, and is obliged to starve in winter." "Yes, you may well say that is a sensible man," said the field mouse. "What does the bird get for all his twittering when the winter comes? He must starve and freeze. But I suppose that is considered very grand." Thumbelina said nothing, but when the two others had turned their backs upon the bird, she bent down, and putting the feathers aside which covered its head, she kissed him upon his closed eyes. "Perhaps it was he who sang so beautifully to me in the summer," she thought. "How much pleasure he has given me, the dear, beautiful bird." The mole now stopped up the hole through which the daylight shined in, and then accompanied the ladies home. But at night Thumbelina could get no sleep. She got up from her bed and wove a fine large carpet of hay, which she carried along and spread out over the dead bird. She also laid the tender stamina of flowers, which were as soft as cotton, and which she had found in the field mouse's room, around the bird, so that he might lie warm. "Goodbye, you beautiful little bird," she said. "Goodbye, and many thanks for your beautiful singing in the summer, when all the trees were green and the sun shined down warm upon us." Then she laid her head upon the bird's heart. But the bird was not dead. He was only lying there benumbed, and having now been warmed again, was coming back to life. In autumn all the swallows fly away to warm countries, but if there is one who is belated, it gets so frozen and it drops down as if dead, and remains lying there where it falls, and soon the cold snow covers it. Thumbelina trembled, so frightened was she, for the bird was big, very big compared with her, who was only an inch long. But she took courage, and laying in the cotton more closely round the poor swallow, she fetched a leaf of mint, which she herself had used as a blanket, and laid it over the bird's head. The next night she again stole up to him. He was alive, but very weak, and could open his eyes only for a short moment to look at Thumbelina, who stood before him with a piece of decaying wood in her hand, for she had no other lantern. "Thank you, my pretty little child," said the sick swallow to her. "I have been so beautifully warm. Soon I shall get my strength back, and will then be able to fly about in the warm sunshine outside. Oh," said she, "it is cold outside. It is snowing and freezing. Stay in your warm bed. I will care for you." Then she brought the swallow some water in the leaf of a flower. This the swallow drank, and told her how he had worn one of his wings on a thorn bush, and had therefore been unable to fly so quickly as the other swallows, who had flown far away to warm countries. So he had at last fallen to the ground, but could not remember anything more, and did not at all know how he had come there. So he remained down there the whole winter, and Thumbelina nursed and tended him with all her heart. Neither the mole nor the field mouse knew anything about it, for they did not like the poor swallow at all. As soon as spring came, the sun warmed the earth, and the swallow said goodbye to Thumbelina, who opened the hole which the mole had made above. The sun shined in beautifully upon them, and the swallow asked her whether she would go with him. She could sit on his back, he said, and they would fly far into the green forest, but Thumbelina knew that it would grieve the old field mouse if she left her like that. "No, I cannot," she said. "Goodbye, goodbye, you pretty little girl," said the swallow, and flew into the sunshine. Thumbelina looked after him, and the tears came into her eyes, for she was very fond of the poor swallow. "Tweet, tweet," sang the bird, and flew into the green forest. Thumbelina was very sad. She got no permission to go out into the warm sunshine. The corn which had been sown on the field over the house of the field mouse grew up high into the air. It was a thick wood for the poor little girl, who was only an inch high. "Now you are a bride, Thumbelina," said the field mouse. "Our neighbor has asked for your hand. What a great piece of luck for a poor child. Now you will have to make your outfit, both woolen and linen, for you must lack nothing when you are the mole's wife." Thumbelina had to turn the spindle, and the field mouse hired 4 spiders to weave for her day and night. Every evening the mole used to visit them, and was always saying that at the end of the summer the sun would not shine so warm by a long way, that it was burning the earth as hard as stone. Yes, when the summer was over he would celebrate his marriage with Thumbelina, but the latter was not at all pleased, for she could not bear the tiresome mole. Every morning when the sun rose, and every evening when it set, she stole out to the door, and when the wind parted the ears of corn so that she could see the blue sky, she would think of how bright and beautiful it was out there, and would have a great longing to see the dear swallow again, but he never came back. He had probably flown far away into the beautiful green wood. When autumn came, Thumbelina had her whole outfit ready. "You are to be married in 4 weeks," said the field mouse to her, but Thumbelina wept, and she said she would not have the tiresome mole. "Fiddlesticks," said the mouse. "Don't be obstinate, or I will bite you with my white teeth. He is a fine man whom you are going to marry. The queen herself has not such a black velvety fur. He has a full kitchen and cellar. Be thankful for that." Now the wedding was to take place. The mole had already come to fetch Thumbelina. She was to live with him deep down under the earth and never come out to the warm sunshine, for that he did not like. The poor little girl was very sad. She was now to say goodbye to the beautiful sun, which, while she lived with the field mouse, she had always had permission to look at from the door. "Goodbye, bright sun," she said, and stretched her arms out high, and walked a little way off from the house and the field mouse, for now the corn was cut and there remained only dry stubbles. "Goodbye, goodbye," she said, and wound her arms round a little red flower which was still blooming there. "Greet the little swallow for me if you see him." "Tweet, tweet," suddenly sounded above her head. She looked up and saw the little swallow, who was just flying by. When he spied Thumbelina, he was very pleased. She told him how unwilling she was to marry the ugly mole, and that she would have to live deep down under the earth where the sun never shined. She could not help crying and telling it. "The cold winter is coming now," said the little swallow. "I am flying away to warm countries. Will you come with me? You can sit on my back, then we shall fly away from the ugly mole in the dark room, far away over the mountains to warm countries where the sun shines more beautifully than here, where it is always summer and there are glorious flowers. Do fly with me, dear Thumbelina, you who have saved my life when I lay frozen in the dark underground cellar." "Yes, I will go with you," said Thumbelina, and she seated herself on the bird's back, with her feet on his outspread wing, binding her girdle fast to one of his strongest feathers. Then the swallow flew up into the air over the forest and sea, high up over the great mountains where the snow always lies. And Thumbelina began to freeze in the cold air, but then she crept under the bird's warm feathers and only put out her little head to admire all the beauty beneath her. At last they came to the warm countries. There the sun shined far brighter than here. The sky seemed twice as high, and in the ditches and on the hedges grew the finest green and blue grapes. In the wood hung citron and oranges, and the air was heavy with the scent of myrtle and mint. And on the high roads the prettiest little children ran and played with large colored butterflies. But the swallow flew still further, and it became more and more beautiful. Under the most majestic green trees by the blue lake stood a marble castle of dazzling whiteness, all of the olden time. Vines wound themselves around the tall pillars, and up above there were a number of swallows' nests, and in one of these lived the swallow who was carrying Thumbelina. "This is my house," said the swallow, "but it would not be proper for you to live with me here, and my arrangements are not such as you would be satisfied with. Pick out for yourself one of the most beautiful flowers that are growing down there, then I will put you into it, and you shall have everything as nice as you can wish." "That is glorious," she said, clapping her little hands. There lay a large white marble pillar which had fallen to the ground and broken into 3 pieces. Between these grew the finest large white flowers. The swallow flew down with Thumbelina and set her upon one of the broad petals. But what was her surprise? There in the middle of the flowers sat a little man, as white and transparent as if he were made of glass. He wore the prettiest golden crown on his head and had splendid little wings on his shoulders. He himself was no bigger than Thumbelina. He was the angel of the flower. In every flower lived such a little man or woman, but this one was king of all. "Heavens, how beautiful he is," whispered Thumbelina to the swallow. The little prince was very frightened at the sight of the swallow, for it was a giant bird compared to him, who was so small and delicate. But when he spied Thumbelina, he was greatly pleased. She was the prettiest little girl he had ever seen. He therefore took his golden crown from off his head and put it upon hers, asking her what her name was, and whether she would be his wife. Then she should be queen of all the flowers. He was indeed quite a different man than the son of the toad and the mole with the black velvety fur. She said yes to the grand prince, and out of every flower came a lady and gentleman, so dainty that they were a pleasure to behold. Each one brought Thumbelina a present, but the best of all was a pair of beautiful wings from a large white fly. These were fastened onto Thumbelina's back, and now she too could fly from flower to flower. There was much rejoicing, and the little swallow sat upon his nest and was to sing the bridal song. This he did as well as he could, although in his heart he was sad, for he was so fond of Thumbelina, and he would have liked never to separate himself from her. "You shall not be called Thumbelina," said the flower angel to her. "That is an ugly name, and you are too pretty for it. We will call you Maya." "Goodbye, goodbye," said the little swallow with a heavy heart, and flew away from the warm countries back to Denmark. There he had a little nest over the window where the man lives who can tell tales. To him he sang "Tweet, tweet," and that is how we know the whole story. The end.